Millie Mark had always known her life would never be ordinary. It wasn't just the way she'd hustled her way up in the cutthroat music industry. It was the fact that she was the manager of Oliver Martinez, the pop sensation, who had redefined stardom in the 21st century. She sat in the back of the sleek tour bus, her fingers tapping nervously against her phone screen as she checked yet another set of emails, booking requests, and travel itineraries. Being Oliver's manager meant juggling 100 things at once, and she had mastered it. But tonight was different. The bus rumbled down the road, a soft hum under the constant buzz of Oliver's latest hit playing from the speakers. She could hear the echoes of his voice even when it wasn't on. That was the kind of effect he had on everyone, and especially her. Oliver Martinez was everything a pop star was supposed to be: impossibly handsome, wildly talented, and an enigma, all wrapped up in a package of charisma that left people in awe. She'd seen him grow from a nobody to the international icon he was today, and in many ways, she had been the architect of his rise. But it was always business. Always professional. She had to keep it that way, for both of them. Tonight was the final leg of their world tour, a sold-out show in Madrid. The adrenaline of the crowd, the energy of the music, the flashing lights, it was all part of the magic. She'd always loved this part of the job, but tonight, something had changed. Oliver had been acting different. Maybe it was the exhaustion of the tour catching up with him, or maybe it was the endless hours of practice and performance that had them all on edge. Whatever it was, there was a tension in the air that Millie couldn't ignore. The door to the bus slid open, and Oliver walked in, wiping the sweat off his forehead with a towel, his dark hair damp from the performance. He flashed Millie that signature grin of his, playful, mischievous, yet somehow always calculating. The kind of smile that had made him a household name. "Hey, Millie," he greeted, plopping down across from her. His gaze lingered on her for a second longer than usual, his lips curving slightly upward. Millie forced herself not to react. "Hey," she replied, trying to sound casual as she clicked away on her phone. Her pulse quickened anyway. She couldn't help it. It had been a long few months on the road, and the line between business and personal had started to blur. Oliver stretched his long legs out in front of him, casually tossing the towel onto the seat beside him. He leaned forward, propping his elbow on his knee, watching her with that same intensity that always made her feel slightly exposed. "You okay?" he asked, his voice quieter than usual. Millie swallowed, unsure how to answer. Was she okay? She had to be. That was her job, taking care of everything, making sure the machine ran smoothly. But lately, she'd been feeling things she didn't know how to deal with. Oliver wasn't just her client. He was also the person she'd spent the most time with over the past few years. And it wasn't just the long days and late nights that had gotten under her skin. It was him in a way she hadn't expected. "I'm fine," she said quickly, trying to sound confident, even as her heart picked up speed. Oliver nodded but didn't move his gaze away. His eyes were dark and unreadable, though there was a flicker in them that Millie couldn't quite place. He shifted, closer this time, lowering his voice as he spoke again. "You don't have to be so professional all the time, Millie. You can relax. You've earned it." She exhaled sharply, her fingers now frozen on the screen. He had a way of getting under her skin, making her second-guess herself in ways she never had before. But she couldn't let things get complicated. Not with him. She forced a smile, the practiced, professional one that everyone had come to expect from her. "That's my job, Ollie. And you know I love it." He raised an eyebrow. "MMHMM. His tone suggested he wasn't entirely convinced. But instead of pushing the conversation further, he sat back against the seat and closed his eyes, as if surrendering to the exhaustion that had clearly taken hold of him. For a long moment, there was silence. Millie went back to her emails, trying to focus, but she couldn't stop the feeling that something had shifted between them. It was like the space on the bus had suddenly gotten smaller, even though they were still in their own worlds. She could feel the weight of his presence beside her, and the heat from his body seemed to press against hers, despite the distance. Then, without warning, Oliver leaned closer, his breath warm against her ear. "You know," he whispered, "I've always wondered what it would be like if we weren't just manager and artist." Her breath caught in her throat, and she felt her heart stutter for the briefest of moments. She turned her head to look at him, finding his eyes locked onto hers, intense and unwavering. She couldn't read them, couldn't figure out if he was being playful or serious. But she knew one thing for sure, this was no longer just a casual conversation. Millie opened her mouth to respond, but the words died on her lips. What was she supposed to say? This was the guy she'd helped shape into a global sensation. The guy she'd seen through every high and low of his career. She had been his confidant, his support. She was professional. But then why did she feel like she was standing on the edge of something far more dangerous than she'd ever anticipated? Oliver's hand brushed lightly against hers, an accidental touch, or was it? She looked down at their hands, her pulse suddenly erratic, before looking back up to meet his gaze again. And in that moment, everything she thought she knew about her relationship with Oliver Mark started to crumble. The next day was a blur of press conferences, rehearsals, and last-minute changes. Millie was running on autopilot, doing what she did best, handling the chaos behind the scenes. But she couldn't shake the memory of last night, the sound of Oliver's voice so close to her ear, the heat from his touch. It was all she could think about, even as she crossed things off her never-ending to-do list. She had to remind herself repeatedly that they had a job to do. She had a job to do. Oliver Martinez wasn't just some pop star, he was her client, her responsibility. She'd been his manager long before any feelings had gotten complicated, and she had to keep it that way. The venue was buzzing with energy, the final show of the tour quickly approaching. Millie stood backstage, her eyes scanning the room for any last-minute issues, when she felt a tap on her shoulder. She turned to see Oliver standing there, leaning casually against a pillar with that same half-smile that made her heart flutter, against her will. "Hey," he said, his voice lower than usual. "I need to talk to you for a minute." Millie raised an eyebrow. "About what?" Her tone was sharp, but she didn't mean for it to be. She just didn't have the energy for this right now. There were too many moving parts. She didn't have time for whatever this was. "Come on," he coaxed, stepping closer, his gaze flickering to her lips for a fraction of a second before meeting her eyes again. "It's nothing bad, I promise." She hesitated. He could be charming when he wanted to be, but charm wasn't going to get him out of this one. The boundaries had already been crossed once last night, and she wasn't sure she could handle him pushing any further. "I'm busy, Oliver," she said, her voice firm. "You know we need to be ready for the show." Oliver's smile faltered for a second, but only for a second. He didn't give up easily. "You can spare a few minutes, please." She bit her lip, glancing at her phone, but the truth was, part of her wanted to talk to him, even if she couldn't admit it out loud. That part of her was dangerous, the part that let her forget who she was supposed to be in this equation. "Fine," she said, her voice softer now, "but make it quick." He led her to a quiet corner of the backstage area, away from the chaos of stagehands and dancers running around. The music from the soundcheck thudded in the background, but it felt distant, like they were in a bubble of their own. Once they were out of earshot from anyone, Oliver turned to her, his expression serious. "I need to know where your head's at, Millie." She froze. The intensity in his eyes made her heart race. "What do you mean?" she asked, trying to keep her voice steady. "I mean," he said, taking a step closer, "that last night I couldn't stop thinking about it. You're different with me, Millie. I know you're good at your job, but there's something else. I feel it, and I think you do too." Millie took a sharp breath, her mind spinning. "You don't know what you're talking about," she replied. though even she could hear the uncertainty in her voice. "I do," he said softly, his voice almost a whisper. "I saw the way you looked at me, how you froze when I touched your hand." He paused, his eyes softening. "I know you feel something, too. Don't lie to me." She could feel her walls crumbling, brick by brick. Oliver was so close now, his presence overwhelming. She could smell his cologne, a mix of something musky and fresh, and it made her head spin. She hated how much she wanted him, how much she wanted to ignore all the lines she'd drawn between them. "You're wrong," she said, her voice wavering. It's just been a long tour, Oliver. We're tired. You're exhausted. We're just caught up in the moment." But even as she said it, she knew it wasn't true. It wasn't just the exhaustion. It was him. It was the way he looked at her, the way he made her feel like she was the only one in the room. It was everything she'd been fighting against since day one. Oliver's eyes darkened, and before she could react, he reached out, his fingers brushing the side of her face gently. "I don't believe you, Millie." Her breath hitched at the feel of his skin against hers, his touch sending a jolt of electricity through her veins. He was right. She did feel something. She was scared to admit it, terrified that giving in to this, whatever this was, would change everything. But as he leaned in slightly, his lips so close to hers that she could feel the heat radiating between them, Millie had to make a decision. Could she keep denying what had always been there? Could she keep pretending she wasn't affected by him in every way possible? "I can't," she started, her voice barely above a whisper, but Oliver cut her off. "I know you can," he said, his voice low and husky. "I just don't know if you want to." For a heartbeat, they stood there, the world around them silent as their gazes locked. And for the first time in a long time, Millie wasn't sure of anything. Not the future, not what she wanted. Nothing. But she knew one thing, whatever happened next, nothing would ever be the same.